Hello everyone, and welcome back to episode 9. In this episode we are going to finish off our tabs and how to change the content of our frame that we created depending on which tab has been selected. So if you go into Interface Add-ons, the Aura Tracker, then config.lura, which we have been creating and working on, we need to create two new functions. So I've collapsed all of these functions at the moment, but we actually do need to alter this create menu function where we create our GUI menu. At the moment, we have only created one scrolled child just here. Now this scroll child is being set to the scroll frame using set scroll child. However, we are going to need 3 of these. 3 different scroll childs to act as the content of each of the tab menus. So if you're on one tab, it's going to display one of the scroll childs, and if you're on a different tab, it's going to change the scroll child to display another different frame that we can then use our scroll bar to scroll up and down. So the scroll bar is not necessarily needed, but it's needed for if we have too many items and we want to scroll vertically up and down, and also it will be future-proof if we want to later on add more options to each of the tab menus. So we're going to need 2 functions. One to handle the setting of the tabs, so if we click on one tab, we want the menu to change, so that's obviously going to be one function. And we also need an on-click script handling function so that when you click on a tab, it's also going to do some work as well. Instead of confusing you any further by creating more of an object-oriented approach by having functions inside of tables and calling the function using the table, so the table is acting as an object and the function is going to act like a method, that is one very nice way of organizing your code. But if you don't plan on using a function anymore in the rest of your add-on using the namespace, then you can just leave them as a local function. So these 2 functions here are what we are going to be using. So let me just explain the signature of these functions. Remember that underscore onClick, I use this on purpose to represent an onClick script handler. So this is what's going to be attached using setScript onClick, and you're going to assign it the tab this function. And self is going to be a reference to the tab button itself. And the setTabs function is going to take quite a few different parameters in the function. The first argument we pass to setTabs, known as frame in this local scope for the function, we're going to pass it the UIConfig object. Now you could have removed this and just used the UIConfig reference just here, but I like to pass it a new reference just to get you in the habit of creating reusable functions even though the setTabs function is not reusable. Because maybe this function is going to be passed a different GUI frame and you're going to use the setTabs function on that instead. But honestly, it doesn't really matter. Now, this second argument is called numTabs. It expects a number, like 3 or 4, depending on the number of tabs that you want to attach onto this frame. The reason I have called it numTabs will become apparent later on. Blizzard have their own tab system, as I explained in the last episode, and we want to mimic their tab system to sort of integrate ourselves to better work with the Blizzard tab system, and they depend on a variable called numTabs. Blizzard is going to actively try and find a variable paired onto a table. So for example, the frame should be given a numTabs variable stored into the table. Remember that all widgets are secretly tables, so this is acceptable. So Blizzard is going to look at our frame and expect the numTabs key to be passed a value. So in this example, numTabs is acting as a key, like a variable inside of the frame's table, and it's going to be assigned 5, so Blizzard knows that this GUI component is expected to have 5 tabs assigned to it. Now the variable argument is just a nice convenient way of assigning strings that are going to be attached onto our tabs. So if you remember in the last episode, I showed you an example of what the finished product would look like. And we wanted 3 tabs, called the Appearance tab, the Tracking tab, and the Profiles tab. So this variable argument list is going to be passed different strings representing the tabs that we are going to attach as font strings onto the tab. So if numTabs is going to be 3, we know that the variable argument list is going to have 3 string values stored inside of it. So let's first change this. We said that we don't want just one child frame, we want 3. So let's see what that would look like. So you can comment this out, later on I will delete it, but just to give you a comparison of what we converted, so we changed these 3 lines to this. the set tabs is going to return for us the free scroll frames we've created and assigned onto these tabs that we are creating in the same function. So we're going to pass it, like I said, the GUI config. We're going to say there's 3 tabs, and these are the tab strings that we want to assign onto the tabs. And set tabs will return the scroll childs to us. We know that there are going to be 3 scroll childs, content 1, 2 and 3, because we only want to create 3 tabs. So let me introduce you to a new function called unpack. If we return many different variables using the return keyword from a function, but the problem is we don't know how many things we want to return, because num tabs could be 3 or it could be 5. So if there was 3, we would return 3 scroll children, but if there was 5, we need to return 5 scroll children for the content. So unpack can be thought of as a variable argument list. It gets a table and it converts it back to a list. So in this sense, we are returning an unknown number of variables as long as we stick all of those variables inside of a table and then unpack the table. So you could return contents, which would be one table, and then down here you would unpack it yourself manually and then index the table to retrieve the values, like saying content square brackets 1 to get the content number 1, the first scroll frame. But using unpacked is a nicer way of doing it, because then you don't have to index a random table with an unknown number of values stored inside of the table. Now, like I sort of hinted at earlier, you need to have this frame.numtabs equals numtabs for the Blizzard thing to work. So let's have a look at the Blizzard tab system behind the scenes to see how it actually works. So this time we want to go into shared UI panel templates.lura inside of the Blizzard interface code interface shared XML. Then you'll see the Blizzard code show up. So in Notepad++, if you press Alt and the 0, this is going to fold all of the functions inside of this Lura file. So we have a better abstract view of the entire file as a whole. Now if we scroll down enough, we will find the functions representing the tabs. So we will be using one of these functions, not all of them, but just one. It's called setTab. So if we unfold this, you'll see it takes a frame and an ID. The ID is going to be from 1 to 3 depending on how many number of tabs we have. Blizzard is automatically going to assign a new key onto our frame. Remember that the frame is UI config. This key is going to be selected tab equals ID. Now because we're using an XML template, it's going to have some properties depending on the state of the tab. If the tab is selected, it's going to be golden and slightly larger in height. However, if it's disabled and you can't even click it, then it's going to be grayed out. And if it's not selected but it's accessible, then it's just going to be the standard tab appearance. So the Blizzard tab system depends on a selected tab key, so never use this yourself. It then updates all of the tabs using this function. So let's have a look at this. So this function is saying that if the frame has a selected tab key, then it can go ahead and iterate over every single tab and change the state and update the state depending on if it is disabled, if it is the selected tab, else it's going to deselect the tab. This is why frame.numtabs is critically important. It needs to know how many tabs there are so it can iterate over every single tab and update them correctly. So it uses a local function that we don't have access to because it's not in a global function or in some sort of namespace. It's completely private to the Blizzard code called getTabByIndex. This basically selects the tab depending on the index that the tab has been assigned to. So there's 3 ways to do this. And it is up to us to follow this pattern. It says that if the frame has a key called tabs and this key is a table, so we can index the table depending on the index that we have obtained by iterating over the number of tabs. So I becomes 1, 2, then 3. This is going to be the index of the tab, and we're passing it just here. So, if the frame has a key called tabs, which is a table, or if we're using the global approach by assigning each of the tabs a global variable name. So if tabs does not exist, then we're using the OR operator and saying that if it's global using the global table, saying frame gets name, which returns the global variable name associated with our frame. And obviously we have done that because when we created UI config, this will be the frame. We have assigned it just here a global variable name. So aura tracker config is our global variable name. So getName will retrieve this string that I just showed you, and we are going to concatenate it with the keyword tab and then this also concatenates it together with the index value. If the index was 1, 2 or 3, this is going to be concatenated together to say tab 1, tab 2 and tab 3, which is going to be concatenated with a global variable name. This means that our tab needs to have a global variable name, like if the tab was tab 1, then it will be called aura tracker config tab 1. So you can have it accessible using the global variable name, or shove it into a tabs table and associate that tabs table with the frame. We are going to use the latter option of the global variable name. However, the only reason we're using this method is because at the time I didn't actually know that it has two methods when I wrote this tutorial. So if you want to challenge yourself, use frame.tabs instead. Let's try and see if you can achieve the same results using this method. Now the rest of this code controls the appearance of buttons depending on the state. So if a button is disabled, then it's going to grey it out. If it's enabled, then it has to revert to that. And it controls other appearances of whether a button has been selected or deselected. So this covers the Blizzard tab system. Now we need to comply with the Blizzard tab system by having num tabs, not messing around with the selected tab variable attached to the frame, and also following the accessible feature by giving all of our tabs a global variable name, in the same pattern that Blizzard expects to see. Since we are going to be using the frame name quite often, let's just get it straight away so we can reuse it. So frame name equals frame get name. Next, we are going to iterate over every single tab that we need to create using num tabs. So this for loop is going to iterate the number of times we need to create new tabs and associate the new tabs with a new scroll child, which we are also going to create in the for loop, and then shove that scroll child into the contents table to be unpacked and returned later on. So this is how we are going to create the new tab. We used create frame, and the tab is going to be a button widget. This will be our global variable name that Blizzard relies on. So the frame name concatenated with tab and concatenated with our I variable, which is going to be the index of the tab. And then we are going to parent it with UI config, the frame that we passed to the set tabs function. And finally, we are going to use a new XML template called character frame tab button template. This is the standard XML template that can be used to represent a tab and give us all of the tab features that a Blizzard tab would have inside of the Blizzard interface. The reason I'm using this one is because I was inspired by the tabs used in the character frame. So this is actually the same tab template that the character frame uses. So to better solidify the I acting as the index for our tab, you can use a very generic frame method. Remember that buttons inherit everything from the frame. Frame is the top level widget and all other widgets inherit from it, so even a frame has the setID method. It just allows us to use getID later on to retrieve the ID. You could have done this, tab.index equals I, but setID is a safer method of doing it because index could be overridden in some other code that's out of your control, but setID just makes sure that it's definitely anchored onto the tab and you can only retrieve it using getID. And we'll get into the reason why this is important. We need to use getID later on inside of the tab onClick event so we can tell Blizzard this tab has been selected. Next, we need to use the button setText method. This is going to display the text that we want to appear onto our tab. Remember that we are passing as the variable argument list to the setTabs function the three strings that we want to represent as the tabs. So we want, for example, appearance to be displayed as text on top of the tab that we are creating. So this is what needs to be in setText. So to do this, we use the select function. So by using the index, because this index is going to be from 1 to 3, we can select the first element from the variable argument list, and then next time we loop around, it's going to select the second argument and then the third argument. So this is going to select appearance, then tracking, then profiles, because appearance is the first element inside of the variable argument list, then tracking is the second, and profiles is the third. So next, we need to associate the script behavior for the onClick script with our script handler tab onClick. We could have had this as an anonymous function, but because we are creating 3 tabs and each of the tabs has the exact same onClick script event, we might as well use the same onClick script event handler. Doing this and writing the exact same code repetitively 3 times would just be a waste. So this is how to create a tab. Next, we need to create 3 different scroll childs and associate them with the tab, so the tab knows which scroll child to show and create as the scroll frame's scroll child and actually display it on the screen depending on which tab was selected. But you might be asking yourself, wait a minute, if I'm selecting a tab, that's the behavior of the onClick script event. So surely changing the content displayed on the GUI frame, that's the behavior of clicking a tab. So that should be associated and added inside of the tab onClick event. And you're completely right. This function setTabs is going to create it, but it's not actually going to do the behavior of swapping the content around. So this is the reason that we need to tightly couple together the tab and associate it with the scroll child that we're creating. So to do this, we can associate the scroll child that we're creating and append it as a key onto the tab table. So earlier, when I commented this line out, we're basically reusing this. Remember that we created a scroll child using this, so we can reuse this exactly the same right up here, but instead of making a local variable called child, we are essentially appending the child as a new key called content onto the tab. So you could have called this tab.child, but I named it contents just to remove the confusion because we are creating a table just here called contents, so don't get confused with the terminology, but child and content are basically the same thing as children are to contents. But remember that we also need to set the size of the child, so we are going to copy this line just here and paste it just here, except we're going to change the name of the variable to tab.content. Because we have 3 different scroll childs and none of the tabs have been selected yet, we need to hide them by default. So now I have just added these 3 lines. Now these lines of code are just for the tutorial only, just to show you the difference and changes. So when I click on a tab, it's going to change the color of the texture that I've just added to the scroll child to really kind of reflect that these scroll childs are going to be changed. Because at the moment they're completely bland, there's nothing inside of each of the scroll children, I have created a new texture and the color of these textures are going to be completely random. Math.random returns a value from 0 to 1 in decimals, so maybe 0.5, and this represents the RGB color values. So all of the textures appended to each of the scroll children are going to be completely random, and we're going to set all of the points of this texture to true so that it's going to take up the entire space of the tab.content. So this is just to show you that the tabs are changing the content successfully. And then we're going to add the tab.content, the scroll child that we just created, into the contents, so that we can return and unpack all of the contents so that it can be returned. So content 1, 2 and 3 will be the scroll children that we are creating in this for loop. So far we have created the tab, we have created the scroll child associated with the tab and created it as fake sort of backgrounds just to represent the tab. But the final thing is that we need to use setPoint. These tabs will never be displayed unless you set it a point. So this is how we are going to do it. If I equals 1, meaning if this is the first tab that we have created, we want it in a different position compared to the other tabs that follow suit. So if this is the first tab that we are creating, we want to append the top left point of that tab to the bottom left corner of the frame that we are adding the tab to. And obviously the frame in this case is UI config, representing the GUI frame that we are creating. I have also gave it an X offset and a Y offset of 5 and 7 just to better position the tab. Now I did this because I tested it out in advance, but maybe you might need to experiment with these, moving it a bit to the left, a bit to the up and down to get it in the perfect position using the X and Y offset. So if you create any other tabs in the future after you have created the first tab, then you don't want to append this to the GUI frame, but instead you append the top left point to the previous frame that you had just created in the previous loop to that the previous frame's top right point, so that it's going to be displayed perfectly on the right hand side of the previous tab. And remember that in order to access the previous tab, we use frame name and tab because we're using the global variable method, and we're going to get the index, so 2 or 3 and -1. So the second tab will be anchored to the first tab, and you get the basic idea. So this now completes the for loop. We've iterated 3 times for each tab that we want to create, associated it with the scroll child and set the point, and added the scroll child to the contents table. Now the very last thing we do in this set tabs function is to declare which tab should be selected by default. At the moment there is no selected tab, so we can call the tab onClick script event ourselves and pass it the first tab using the global variable name, as seen just here. Remember that you could have done this instead if you knew the name of the global variable name, but we used frame because I wanted to show you a reusable version of the set tabs function so that you could reuse this for any number of GUI frames if you didn't know the actual frame being passed to it. So if you did aura tracker config tab 1, this just means that this set tabs function is no longer reusable. So now there are only 2 things left to do. We need to finish off the tab onClick function, and we also need to do something with the things that we are returning. So let's restructure this code very quickly. So all of these GUI components that we have previously created, these are going to be displayed on the first tab, the Appearance tab. And eventually in the Tracking and Profiles tab, this is going to be added and appended onto the Content 2 and Content 3 scroll child underneath the Content 2 and Content 3 comment section just down here. We also need to change the child just here to Content 1. And also, rather than calling this uiconfig.save button, we really should be appending the save button reference as a key onto Content 1 so that we can avoid clashes. For example, what would happen if you had a load button using this same key, but you wanted to create a new button and attach it onto Content 2 or Content 3? Then, if you're using the UI config, there's going to be some collisions, especially with such a generic name like Slider 1 and Slider 2. And also, while I'm at it, I'm also going to change the parent to just Content 1. This is because if we are attaching widgets onto Content 1 and we want to hide Content 1, if the parent was UI config scroll frame, there's going to be a lot of issues. If you parent all the widgets to the scroll frame and you want to hide the child, because all of these widgets aren't parented to the child, they're not going to be hidden successfully, and it's going to create a graphical bug. So remember to remove that as well. So now that that is taken care of, at the moment we have Content 1 which has a bunch of widgets, and Content 2 and 3 which has nothing on them, but we have attached onto all of these things a new texture which has random different colours, so we are going to be able to see a difference. Now finally, we need the behaviour for changing the content and selecting the right tab. So the first thing we want to do is use the Blizzard function to set the correct tab, which is panel templates _ set tab, and it requires the frame and the ID. So to pass the frame, you could pass it aura tracker config, or the UI config local variable which holds the exact same frame, or you could get the parent of the tab, because when we created the tab, we supplied it the frame as the parent. So self get parent is my personal preferred method of doing this because I like to make code as reusable as possible to get into the habit of doing this, even if we don't even need to reuse the local function. And remember that the ID of the tab, we can obtain it using getID as shown earlier on when we set the ID just here. So the first time you click tab on click, it's not going to have a scroll frame set to it just yet, but if there is one, meaning that you've clicked a tab a second or third time, any of the tabs, there will be a scroll child because we are going to set the scroll child after this if statement has been completed. But if there is a scroll child, then we want to hide this scroll child and show the new scroll child. Because we associated the tab with a key called contents just here, we can use self.contents because self is the frame itself. That gets passed to us automatically when the onClick script fires. So we can use self.content to refer to the new content that we want to set as the scroll child, and then finally show the content. So that's all you need to do. These are the two functions that we have created in this episode successfully finished. So now let's head into World of Warcraft to see if there are any bugs, and if there are, we will address and fix them in this episode. Okay, so now we're logged in, and remember that we need to use our / command to show the menu. So far no LoRa errors have shown, and remember that I added a random texture as the background for each individual frame, so this one just happens to be green, but maybe the other tabs will show a different colour. Yep, so this one has shown pink, but for some reason the buttons have been displayed there, so that's actually a graphical bug on my part. And then we click profiles and it shows blue. So these tabs are now successfully changing the scroll child. So the reason for this graphical bug is most likely a parenting issue. The parent of these buttons has not been set to the scroll child and instead has been set to something else, and when we change it's not hiding them correctly. So let's quickly try and observe the error that I created. So these 3 buttons just here are having problems. So far this looks completely fine, but we're using create button, a function that we created in another episode. Okay, so here's the problem. You see here we use create frame, and the parent is once again uiconfig.scrollFrame. We want to change this to the scroll child, and that scroll child is in this case the relative frame. So we're using the relative frame as both the setting point and the parent, and then it will work. So save this and reload the game. So yes, now the buttons are not showing, and we have a different random color. This one is purple, and profiles we have a green content frame. One improvement that you may have to make in the future, the size of this scroll child for the profiles tab most likely will need to be a different height compared to the tracking tab and the appearance tab, and we set them all the exact same size. Inside of this function just here, we set them all to have a width of 308 and a height of 500. Maybe you should take this out and put them outside of the set tabs function just here instead. So content 1, set size, and set it a new size or a different height. So anyway, that ties it up for this episode. This has been a very advanced episode, and congratulations if you managed to get through it and followed everything I said, but I don't expect everyone to, and feel free to ask any questions if you have any, and I'll try my best to answer them in a future episode or in the comments section. Thank you very much for watching. This has been Mayron, and bye for now.